Welcome, everyone. Welcome back to the Cocoa Futures three-part webinar series on innovation, impact, and indulgence in chocolate's next era, hosted by Branch Food in partnership with Business Location Switzerland. By way of introduction, my name is Lauren Abdon. I'm the founder of Branch Food. We're a launchpad for food innovation and one of the largest networks of food industry stakeholders worldwide. At Branch Food, we connect every corner of the food ecosystem through events and programs, much like this webinar series. We do consulting for larger corporations that are working and thinking about their business and its work in the future of food. And we also make investments in promising new startup ventures. You can learn more about our work at branchfood.com, our investment work at branchventuregroup.com, or just reach out to me directly. My email is lauren@branchfood.com. I'm also thrilled to welcome and recognize our partners at Business Location Switzerland. BLS is a national initiative bringing together Switzerland Global Enterprise, the Swiss business hubs worldwide, and regional promotion agencies such as Greater Zurich Area, GZA, Switzerland Innovation, Invest Western Switzerland, Basel Area Business and Innovation, St. Gallen, Bonnsey Area, and other cantonal and regional economic development organizations. Together, they help international companies explore and establish a presence in Switzerland by providing market insights, regulatory guidance, and introductions to universities, research institutes, incubators, and industry networks. If you're interested in learning more about how Switzerland can support your company's growth and be a future base, please don't hesitate to connect with the BLS team. I am happy to introduce you to them. Again, please just engage with some of the emails we've been sending many of you to join this webinar, and we're happy to ensure you meet them. So in the first session of our Cocoa Futures webinar series 2 weeks ago, we explored the technologies and innovations that are reimagining how chocolate is made, sourced, and experienced. If you didn't catch that session, you could find it on the Branch Food YouTube page. Our next session today, we're taking a critical look at the environmental and human costs behind the chocolate industry and how leading companies and organizations are working to mitigate them. So finally, I'd like to introduce our moderator for the series, Elizabeth Crawford, who is the senior editor of Food Navigator USA. Elizabeth brings more than 2 decades of experience covering the food, supplement, and healthcare industries, reporting on everything from investment and innovation to ingredients, regulatory developments, labeling, and emerging trends. She is also the host of Food Navigator USA's Soup to Nuts podcast, a go-to resource for understanding what's next in the food and beverage space. So Elizabeth, we're thrilled to have you again to lead today's conversation. Thank you very much. And over to you to start the webinar.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for having me and Lauren for bringing us all together for this second installment in a very important three-part webinar series exploring the future of cocoa. As Lauren mentioned, I'm Elizabeth Crawford. I'm the senior editor for Food Navigator USA, and I'm really honored to be a part of such an important, timely topic that we're covering today and next session and last session as well. I think chocolate is obviously one of the world's most beloved indulgences, or for some of us, an everyday treat. But behind the sweetness, there are some bitter truths, right? Including the complexities of climate change, deforestation, and human rights challenges that are all sort of tangled up with cocoa production. Today, we're going to explore the extent and impact of these challenges, as well as how leaders across certification, sourcing, research, and advocacy are all reshaping the cocoa supply chain to be more transparent, fair, and resilient so that consumers, myself included, can continue to enjoy chocolate for generations to come. To help us unpack the challenges and opportunities surrounding cocoa production, I'd like to introduce our esteemed panel. With me today are Carla Martin, the founder and president of the Board of Institute of Cacao and Chocolate Research, Sarah Crom, regional lead corporate engagement and partnerships with Rainforest Alliance, Danny Magle-Hayes with partnerships at Tony's Open Chain, and Ingrid Fromm, senior researcher and lecturer at the School of Agriculture, Forest, and Food Sciences at Bern University and Applied Sciences. Thank you all for joining me today. So let's begin by looking first at the top challenges and sort of positioning us in the threats to cocoa sustainability at a high level, and then we'll take a deeper dive into the extent and explore sort of the potential solutions, opportunities, collaborations, and obviously key takeaways for everyone here today. That said, if you are watching and you have questions, please do drop them in the Q&A, and I will do my best to either weave them into the conversation as they pop up or save some time at the end to direct them to the panel. I will try my hardest to watch both the Q&A box and the webinar chat, but if you think about it, it's a little easier for me to follow the questions in the Q&A chat. Okay, so housekeeping out of the way, let's explore the interplay between the environment and cocoa production, which I think is a multifaceted challenge, and we'll hear today about how it's simultaneously driven by each side of the equation. Sarah, I would love if you could start us off by sharing how climate change is impacting cocoa sustainability in different geographies, right? And how some producers' short-term solutions may actually make climate-related challenges worse in the long term by negatively impacting soil health or leading to deforestation or other complications.
Sure. Thank you, Elizabeth. So first of all, I think it's important to know that cocoa trees grow in the tropics around the equator, and they're very sensitive to environmental changes. And so in West and Central Africa, so Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Nigeria, and Cameroon, where over 70% of the world's cocoa is produced, we've seen rising temperatures and changes in rainfall. And so if temperatures rise above the optimal range for cocoa trees, it can impact tree growth, flowering, pod development, and the heavy rains can really promote also a spread of a fungus called black pod disease, as well as the swollen shoot virus, which is transmitted actually by little insects called mealybugs, but they kill the cocoa trees. So quite a few of those diseases have popped up. And we're also seeing these kind of changing weather patterns along and with longer dry spells and more intense rains in Latin America and Southeast Asia. So origins like Ecuador, Brazil, or Indonesia, where those events are disrupting pollination, for example, causing erosion or increasing the disease risk that I mentioned. And so in the past years, weather phenomena like El Nino have also exacerbated extreme weather patterns. And this global trend is really putting cocoa production at risk. So they really are factors that decrease crop yield, crop quality, and ultimately also farm resilience. And you mentioned some short-term solutions, and those are usually by farmers to help increase productivity. And they've centered quite heavily on growing cocoa in monocultures, for example, with few shade trees, or heavily applying agrochemicals to suppress any diseases or to boost yields in degraded soils. And there's also been significant encroachment into forests and protected areas to expand farms. The soil tends to be quite fertile or nutritious. And so research has actually shown that sustainable agricultural methods, like the ones that we also promote at the Rainforest Alliance, can significantly improve cocoa yields without farm expansion or intensification. So for example, climate smart agriculture or regenerative farming practices, and I'm sure we'll go into that a little bit, but those can really increase production and safeguard farmer livelihoods. So some of the practical strategies, right, which are more longer term, focus around agroforestry, for example, growing cocoa trees together with native plants to enhance soil structure and prevent flooding, or practices like cover cropping and composting to increase soil health. So all of those kind of practices can help regulate some of the temperatures and improve soil health, like you were saying, to ensure really long-term farm resilience.
Fantastic, thank you. Danny, I know this is also something that you work on at Tony's. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of environmental impact challenges around cocoa production and how that might compare to Sarah's experience and the different regions you're in?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Elizabeth. I think and Sarah hit on the region that Tony's Open Chain, and for those in the audience might not be so familiar with Tony's Open Chain, that is the impact sourcing solution behind Tony's Chocolate Only. We work exclusively in West Africa, specifically in Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, right? And that's not random. It is by design. Sarah said these two countries produce 70% of the world's cocoa. Yet when you look at the scale, the supply chain is deeply fractured. You have 2.5 million smallholder farmers in the region growing cocoa on really small plots of land, and that fragmentation is a big reason why so many of the problems in cocoa persist today. In that, obviously, environmental issues, but if we're looking at the environmental impacts, we also have to look at the root cause, and in this case it is poverty, right? Farmers specifically in the region remain underpaid and are earning below a living income, and therefore unable to invest in their farms, right? Soil health, how to improve yields, and because of that they're often clearing forests to plant more cocoa. And so we're seeing that, right? If you look at just the last 30 years, Ghana has lost 65% of its forest cover, and in Cote d'Ivoire up to 90%. And then, as Sarah was describing, you add in these extreme climate conditions in the mix. We saw in the 23-24 season the worst drought since 2003. In other recent years, it's been heavy rainfall. And so these extremes have led to an abundance of aging and diseased cocoa trees, obviously increasing the risk, not to just people, but also our planet. And so, yeah, at the same time, there's been, what you can call, chronic underinvestment in the cocoa sector. In some cases, government restrictions on planting new cocoa seedlings. And so this has made the system even more vulnerable, right, to climate shocks, and has certainly accelerated the spreads of, pests and diseases. And because of that, like, naturally the production is going to drop, right? And in this case, by nearly 1 million metric tons over the past 3 years in these two countries, right? In Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana alone. And yeah, when the two countries responsible for 70% of the world's cocoa face not only social and economic challenges, but also escalating environmental ones, we see the downstream effects, right? In this case, or in the last year, I'm sure those who are here know of the record high cocoa prices that we're seeing. And I don't think any of us really know where the market will settle. But I think what we do know is that we can't just sit here, accept the reality and do nothing. The real fix is a long-term solution that puts farmers at the center.
Thank you. And I am excited to talk sort of about some of these solutions. I think you raise a really good point about poverty being the link or a common ground among some of these things, right? And so cocoa production is fraught with labor challenges, where it's tangled up with macro political and economic factors as well. And Carla, I think this is something that you're working on, right, as a social anthropologist, whose focus is on ethics, quality, and politics in cacao and chocolate. Can you share a little bit with us at a high level, again, sort of the interplay of these variables across the different geographies?
Absolutely. So cocoa is very much of many, many different countries, which means that any given solution proposed, root cause proposed, is also highly regional at community levels. And so we're hearing a variety of different things, like about volatile prices, producer poverty, deforestation, plant disease, labor precarity, illegal mining, climate shocks. Each of these things plays out in different ways in different places. We've also heard about potential solutions, things like pathways toward agroforestry, providing better weather intelligence as we see precipitation and drought impact cocoa, moving to value-added models locally. Very much within the social sciences, we advocate for producer-centric approaches at local and community levels that are co-designed with cocoa producers toward success. And so that's a really key part of what is necessary to solve these problems, without kind of doing top-down models that presuppose what it is that producers need to succeed. Rather, these need to be things that are created jointly with cocoa producing communities. In addition to that, there are a number of issues that are unlikely to be solved by cocoa or chocolate alone. So, for example, deeper Pan-African or South-South collaboration around crop research more broadly, around financing. Much of the world's trade takes place in the US dollar, which puts a lot of countries at a distinct disadvantage if they're constantly translating everything into their local currency. That's not a specific chocolate problem. That's a global economic finance problem. So all of these kinds of things also require non-chocolate solutions. And more than ever, what we really are looking for are things that get away from separate or siloed solutions, like, for example, buyer or private company-led sustainability solutions, and move toward collaborative, co-designed, and sovereign solutions that allow cocoa producers and the countries of which they are a part to take a leading role in finding solutions to these kinds of intractable problems that we're discussing today.
I'm excited to, like I said earlier, to talk about some of these solutions. And I appreciate 2 points there that you made that we will go into more about the need for not just top-down models, but bringing buy-in across the value chain. And then also your point about this is not just a cocoa problem, right? We'll talk about this throughout the next 60 minutes, but a lot of crops are facing the same challenges. So let's all keep that in mind as we continue our conversation. But I do want to stick here. I know nobody likes a negative Nelly, but I'm going to make us stick here for another minute talking about these challenges because we've heard a couple of times about um, the high cost of cocoa as a result from some of these challenges. But that hasn't necessarily translated to higher benefits for farmers. And so, Ingrid, I would love to bring you into the conversation, right? How do you see the current economic environment impacting stakeholders across the value chain? And why aren't these high prices benefiting the producers?
Okay. Um, Thank you. And I would like to start by saying that some of the root causes have already been mentioned by Sarah, Danny, and Carla. To say that we've been in a roller coaster for the last 18 months is probably an understatement. The volatility and the prices that we've been seeing since 2024, early 2024, have left stakeholders across the whole value chain really grappling for answers and dealing with multiple uncertainties. Let me put that into perspective. For the last 10 years or so, let's say from 2015 to 2025 or before 2025, we have seen very stable prices, somewhere between 2,000 to 4,000 US dollars per ton of cocoa. And all of this reached a peak last year, and the prices really increased to somewhere or almost close to $13,000 per metric ton. So this was December last year. Currently, the price per ton of cocoa is somewhere just under $6,000. So you see that there has been a lot of changes, ups and downs, and that means that there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of volatility, and this places farmers at a greater risk. The industry, of course, has its response mechanisms, but usually it is smallholders across West Africa or other parts of the world that are struggling to come up with answers. Part of the problem, I would say, has to do with the fact that these high prices don't always trickle down all the way to the producer level. So that means that farmers are still struggling. Part of the issue with these increase in prices has to do with shortages. So the ICCO statistic mentions that 2023-2024 season meant that we had a shortage of 478,000 metric tons. That's not good news for farmers in West Africa because it means that they're really not producing enough. They're tackling issues like cocoa sole and shoot virus, and they don't always have the mechanisms to respond to these huge challenges. And certainly they do not have the means to deal with this. And of course, it also boils down to the issue of plant breeding and varieties that should be planted. It takes time to see results over time. Of course, it's a huge undertaking to renovate plantations and bring in breeding material, new material that is actually resistant or can cope better to drought or to diseases. And usually the farmers don't have the means to make these huge investments. So that places them at a big risk. And I think these are the issues that we're currently dealing with. And I think we need a combination of science. We need a combination of policy and engagement from different actors, private sector, I would say NGO and civil society, and very important actors. And I think that in order to address these challenges, we really have to work together to bring solutions to the farmers at the field level.
Thank you. And so, yeah, so let's talk about some of these solutions, right? I mean, I'm sure we could talk for more than an hour about the challenges, but there are lots of models for success, and lots of the folks on the panel today have some thoughts on that. But I also know that we have experts in the audience, and so please do use the chat as we go along. If you have a model or a solution that you want to uplift, drop it in the chat, like Carla just did. So against the sort of grim backdrop, right? Let's talk solutions. Danny, I want to start with you, right? So Tony's, and I'm not even going to try and pronounce the back half of your brand name because I get tongue-tied every time. But Tony's has been a vocal leader in ethical sourcing. Can you share with us the company's 5 sourcing principles and how they address some of the root causes that we've already talked about today?
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, Tony's chocolate only, right? And again, I'm part of Tony's Open Chain, which is the sourcing model behind Tony's chocolate only, as you all know it, right? The consumer brand that sits as a bar on shelf. At the core of Tony's are, as you mentioned, our 5 sourcing principles, and these aren't standalone actions. They reinforce each other and really are foundational, right? And how we work to make cocoa more responsible, more transparent, with all the challenges that we've just discussed at the center. And so I'll touch on a few of these more maybe than others. The first sourcing principle is traceability, right? And for us, that sits on 3 pillars: social, environmental, and operational traceability. Operational traceability is powered by what we call our bean tracker tool, really literal, right? And what we're doing there, it gives us the end-to-end visibility into every cocoa beans journey, from farm to co-op to export, all the way to our processing partners. The second pillar is environmental traceability, right? And that's what focus on deforestation. 100% of farmers at our partner cooperatives in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire are GPS polygon mapped, and that's what enables us to verify that cocoa in our supply chain is deforestation free. And then the third pillar within the traceability sourcing principle is what we call social traceability, and that means we know who is growing our cocoa and also under what conditions. And so this is where our CLMRS, our Child Labor Monitoring and Remediation System, sits. Every household in the Tony's Open Chain network is visited annually and is carried out, and this is really important, carried out by trained community facilitators. These are members of the cooperative teams who live in the communities. They know the families, they're trusted locally, and then they're further supported by what we call a monitoring and remediation agent, right? These are folks who are helping coordinate the work and ensuring that remediation plans aren't just relevant, but also resourced. The second sourcing principle is paying a higher price. Now, a bit of a moving story here. Historically, that's meant bridging the gap between the government set farm gate price in Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana and the living income reference price as defined by fair trade. So if you look at the 23-24 season, Mission Allies, those are partners of Tony's Open Chain, of which Tony's Chocolate Only is one, paid 44% above the farm gate price in Cote d'Ivoire and 18% above in Ghana. Obviously, that's a tangible commitment to supporting farmers. In this last season marked a shift, right? For the first time, we saw that the farm gate price actually exceeded the LERP, right? The living income reference price. And it's doing so again this year, right? There was just a historical announcement in Cote d'Ivoire in their farm gate price. I think for those who might not be so close or in the industry, on paper, I think that looks like progress. In practice, yields remain historically low. You obviously have rising production costs that are eating into potential gains. And I think we could spend hours on these two pricing dynamics. And for us at Tony's, like the relationship between them. But it's also why we're doubling down on other sourcing principles, right? So the biggest focus for us is on our third sourcing principle, which we call productivity and quality, right? Paying more is only part of the solution. We also need to ensure that farmers can grow more and can grow better sustainably. Again, quality and productivity being that third sourcing principle. I just said we are doubling down on the productivity programming. Carla, like you said, like co-designing this with those at origin is so important. So we have these tailored productivity packages co-designed with our partner cooperatives, we think when we look at our sourcing principles that this is the lever we can most control, right? The one most capable of shifting outcomes at scale. And, if you look at past years, we've laid a really strong foundation, but this year we're adding 2 layers on top of the foundations that we've built with, like I said, these improved productivity packages. And so one being an infrastructure layer and the second, a transformation layer. Again, that's on top of the foundation that we've built. So that means 100% subsidy for baseline agroforestry, right? Seedlings and planting of shade trees, more intensive coaching with tailored farm recommendations. We've had labor brigades in our network, but professionalizing those labor brigades, right? Meaning greater availability and skill of the labor brigades. And then that other layer, like I just said, is around transformation. Sarah was talking about some of the diseases we're seeing in cocoa trees. They're also too old, right? 40% of cocoa trees in Cote d'Ivoire are too old. Cocoa swollen shoot virus, a bit of a tongue twister, CSSV, affects up to 75% of trees in some regions, which means replacing trees is 4 years without income. So most farmers don't do it. And this is where we're also trying to take lead, right? Like enabling large scale renovation, replacing trees with new improved varieties, which again can take 4 years to become productive. And so looking at how we can also compensate farmers for that lost income. And then rehabbing, right? Like actually increasing the product, like the productive capacity of the farm and providing farmers with tools, labor, and support they need to fully transform their farms. So that's the third sourcing principle, the one we're really, really focused on this year. The last two I'll touch on quickly. The fourth is what we call strong farmers, right? Like all of the work on the ground, program implementation, support, relationship building, all that happens through our partner cooperatives. And we're really deliberate in how we frame that, right? We never refer to them as our co-ops. They're not. We're simply a customer of theirs. And I think obviously we're striving to set the standard for what a responsible buyer should look like. And we're currently working with 22 cooperatives in the region, right? And we're hoping by the end of this season, we can say that, we have 40,000 farmers in the Tony's Open Chain network. Because farmers are the members of these cooperatives and the co-op leadership is democratically appointed by those members, it creates a structure where farmers have real ownership and influence, right? That's what we mean by stronger farmers. And then the last sourcing principle is what we call long-term commitment. So we sign Tony's Open Chain 5-year contracts with each of our partner cooperatives. And in return, Mission Allies, again, these are partners of Tony's Open Chain sourcing from the same cooperatives. They also commit to sourcing cocoa for at least 5 years. And it really is a two-way commitment that gives co-ops and farmers something rare in cocoa, and that's predictability, right? Specifically long-term buying relationships. And so, I think what we've seen instead is short-term contracts, price volatility being the norm. If we want to break this cycle, what I like to call like survival mode farming and enable real lasting change, I think we need to give farmers, right, the confidence to invest in their farms, their families, their communities with a longer horizon in sight. Those are 5 sourcing principles. Obviously, if there's any questions on them, feel free to put them in the chat and I'll field them.
Awesome, thank you. You mentioned in your 5th pillar there, your mission allies, and I do want to touch on them a little bit more if you don't mind. I mean, what's the business case here for collaboration over competition?
Yeah, it's a good question. Actually, Carla, last night I had the chance to read the white paper you published with, I think it was your colleague Emmanuel. I think it was maybe this month on the future of Africa's cocoa industry. And I'd recommend everyone here to obviously read that. Throughout the paper, I noticed some recurring phrases like collective action or shared responsibility, which I think obviously resonates with me. It resonates with Tony's Open Chain. That's what we're working toward with our model, right? We know we can't tackle these challenges alone. And that's why we've opened up our supply chain through a collaborative industry sourcing model, right? Built on the 2 decades of impact-driven work by Tony's Chocolate Only. And so, through this model, Elizabeth, other companies who we call mission allies, Ben & Jerry's is a good example here in the US, who is a partner of mine, they can take real ownership of their supply chain by sourcing directly from the partner cooperatives and the farmers in our network, where our 5 sourcing principles are at work. So the idea is that like collaboration and competition, they're not mutually exclusive, right? Companies can achieve commercial success while also taking full responsibility for their supply chains through collective action. You don't have to sacrifice one for the other.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I think it's important,
Yeah.
right? In order to do good, businesses still have to do good. So I appreciate
Yeah.
that point. Um, Sarah, we have a question from the audience for you that I think fits in nicely here, right? So can you talk a little bit about how the Rainforest Alliance is addressing both the human rights, but then the question from the audience is around deforestation and how to encourage producers to transition to climate smart agriculture?
Sure. So I think I mentioned previously that the Rainforest Alliance is best known for its certification program, and that provides farmers, but also supply chain actors with guidance, tools, training, and importantly also incentives for more sustainable cocoa and chocolate production. And there are obviously a variety of different chapters within these requirements for on more sustainable farming, environmental protection, as well as social topics. And maybe we can focus specifically on the deforestation and climate smart agricultural practices because those are obviously really key. I know Danny mentioned that similar for Tony's Open Chain, we collect geolocation data, and then there's a deforestation and encroachment risk assessment that gets done. The data is very much owned by the farm certificate holders. They get the risk assessments. They can see where there or if there are any medium or high risk plots, and then go there. And the focus really is around assessing through satellite imagery, but then also really ground truthing and supporting with mitigation actions. But also being quite strict about deforestation cutoff rates or dates. In our case, it's basically January 1st, 2014, when we said that that's the deforestation cutoff. So any farms that have shown any deforestation after that cannot be certified. But then also it's very much around how can we help farmers increase productivity, but also adapt to climate change and some of the challenges that I mentioned earlier. So climate smart agricultural practices are really integrated within the requirements of the standard. And for us, it's really key that there's training, right? So we have teams on the ground and all of the key cocoa growing origins, and they're supporting there with training and really learning from each other in terms of what climate smart agriculture can look like, and then even going above and beyond that towards regenerative agriculture, because sustainable agriculture is really more about doing less harm, but it's really more about going towards regeneration and how can we renovate some of those cocoa plantations, but also make them fit for some of those weather events that we were talking about earlier. So that is one aspect of it. And then there's also very much a risk-based approach around social topics. So I know Danny also mentioned CLMRS, so around addressing or assessing and addressing child labor. And for us, there are a couple of other human rights issues that we integrate in our human rights due diligence system. So for us, forced labor, discrimination, workplace violence, and harassment are also really key topics. So the concept that we've come up with and integrated, which is based on UN best practices, it's called an assess and address approach. And again, here it's very much around providing training to farmers and then also making sure that farmers and companies are supported to create grievance mechanisms and to create specific committees that are focused on human rights. And again, here they're centered in the community, and they're the ones who really understand these topics and have that type of authority to really identify and assess risks around human rights, to determine monitoring and prevention measures, and manage identified cases and then effectively remediate those. So this enables farmers to tackle some of those root causes around human rights issues that we're seeing. And it also enables companies to increase transparency, verify improvement, and then ultimately also show due diligence.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. I think it's really important to just want to lift up what you mentioned there about your grievance mechanisms, because we had talked about the importance of community buy-in across all stakeholders. And Danny, you also mentioned this, right, with the trained community facilitators. So I just want to acknowledge the efforts that both of you all are making on that front in order to have buy-in. I also want to explore some other multi-stakeholder platforms and approaches for long-term transformation. Ingrid, share with us some of the work that you've done with the Swiss platform Sustainable Cocoa and the extent to which Swissco's approach can scale.
So Swissco, the Swiss Platform for Sustainable Cocoa, it's a multi-stakeholder platform, an initiative that was founded in early 2018. And we're one of these initiatives for sustainable cocoa currently in existence in Europe. The Dutch have one, in Belgium, there's Beyond Chocolate, Germany, of course, being the first country that launched such an initiative. These initiatives actually bring different stakeholders together. And I really believe what Carla mentioned earlier about the co-design process of working together. I think that's it's one transformational aspect of these platforms for sustainable cocoa. One of the, I would say the most positive experiences has to do with an internationally harmonized monitoring system. So it's required some work. It means that we don't duplicate work, but we work together across different European countries to make sure that we're reaching these targets and that we're really addressing these issues together. So it's basically allowed stakeholders across Europe to work together to reach the different goals that we've set up. But just to mention, for the Swiss Platform for Sustainable Cocoa, we have a roadmap. And this roadmap is basically the plan for how we want to achieve sustainability. Well, at the short term, mid to short term, so 2030 and then beyond, up until 2050. And basically, we tackle the issues that we've mentioned so far: living income, child labor, regenerative agriculture, deforestation, climate change, how to mitigate these impacts, and traceability. So these are very concrete ambitions, I would say, but we also address these ambitions through targets, through systems where we have a system in place to be able to measure how we went from point A to point B. And I think this is really transformational. And personally, I think it's setting the way forward for the cocoa sector. Of course, this is an initiative based in Europe, but not only in Europe. A lot of consultation has been done with the partner countries, with West African countries, with Latin America, with other sourcing areas of the world. So I think this has been a big call for transformation at the European level, and hopefully, we're going to see more countries on board with similar initiatives.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. I think one of the important distinctions to make in our conversation is that a lot of these initiatives are voluntary, but there are also some that are not. Carla, and I'm curious if you can pop in here on this one, right? What role do governments play in changing production standards, improving worker welfare, and protecting the environment?
This is such an important question. And if we're thinking about governments in cocoa producing countries, so those in the kind of tropical belt around the globe where cocoa is grown, they are essential partners in legislation for child protection, for labor rights protection, environmental protection, price modeling, etc. And several governments, the governments of Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana are two examples. There are also some in the Caribbean, have what are essentially parastatal organizations that oversee their cocoa industries. So they're more or less a cocoa industry that is overseen by the government. And there's constant debate about whether that is the right model or whether a more kind of neoliberal free market model works differently. For example, like in countries in Nigeria, Cameroon, many places throughout Latin America. Setting all of that debate aside, because I think it's valuable and necessary, but we don't have time to go into it, governments play a crucial role in overseeing what is possible within their countries. Many of the countries in West Africa have some very strong laws against labor rights abuses already, but they experience difficulty in executing them. They also have very strong laws around pricing, around environmental protection. But we exist in a broader society where we have ceded enormous power and control to private corporations that are able to often undermine local cocoa producing governments. I think about this in regards to price setting mechanisms that have been attempted in West Africa, where then we see large numbers of cocoa buying operations that will do absolutely anything that they can to undermine those price setting mechanisms. I think about this in relation to illegal mining taking place in West Africa. The reason that illegal mining has a market is because there are companies that are happy to buy it at enormous environmental expense. Then, if we think about governments in Europe and North America and their responsibility, shared responsibility to deal with climate change, to address issues like deforestation, etc., there's an entire other can of worms that opens. And one thing that's on the tip of many people's tongues today is the future of the European Union deforestation regulation. I bring that up knowing that it feels sort of like a punch in the gut to many of us because there's a lot of uncertainty about its future at this moment. But this is a regulation that is externally imposed for the European Union to cocoa producing regions that was made without any consultation or impact studies among cocoa producers, and that remains in this moment uncertain about whether or not it will be applied. And there is a great deal of responsibility that the European Union needs to take for the impacts of all of that.
That is a very good example, and I'm glad you raised it. I've spent a lot of time this week looking at that. And I think it raises a good point, right? So how do you see some of these interventions landing with farmers and communities? And are there positive steps? Are there positive steps that other stakeholders can take to foster trust or rebuild partnerships that might be threatened by some of these external factors?
Absolutely. Yes. We've looked really carefully at lots of different types of external interventions, and there is a kind of cyclical pattern in what takes place where external interventions that are made without proper consultation, I see a theme of we're using the term co-design, without the full engagement as equal partners in planning of cocoa producers, local governments, and more. Those kinds of external interventions that are done without all of those key parts tend to have really a kind of pat yourself on the back absolution quality only. So they essentially resolve very little other than making the external intervener be able to say, we get to wash our hands of this. We tried to make an external intervention. We told them what they couldn't do, and that's it. The presence of success we find primarily in these types of initiatives that are collective, collaborative, and more. And, one example that I think of frequently are models that bring together the public sector, the private sector, producer organizations, local governments, the governments of buying companies or buying organizations. And those are the ones, multi-stakeholder initiatives, where everyone is brought to the table with kind of equal voice and negotiation power that end up providing the most success.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. So many of the challenges, as we touched on at the top of our conversation, right? Many of the challenges we're talking today in cocoa are not unique to cocoa, but that are also shared across other high value crops like coffee. Ingrid, I know you were at a conference, I think last week, talking about this. Can you share with us some of the successful actions in other areas that you've seen implemented that might actually apply really well in this space?
Yeah, so as you rightly pointed out, I think there's a lot of similarities in the coffee sector, same challenges, and actually affected by the same type of legislation when it comes to EUDR, so the legislation on, or the EU legislation on deforestation-free supply chains. Farmers in different parts of the world are coping or trying to cope with this despite the uncertainties. And I would say that one of the best case experiences that I have seen or that I've heard about is actually when you pull in all the efforts to make sure that compliance comes forward and that you work together to make sure that you start complying. And I heard a presentation about Vietnam, where, of course, through government-led interventions, they've practically mapped out the whole coffee producing areas to make sure that you comply with the geo-referencing. So part of the EUDR requires that you have a due diligence statement, and you also have a geo-reference of where the coffee farm or the cocoa farm is located. And that you're able to prove that it comes from areas that have not been, affected by deforestation since 2020. So you need this type of information. It's very complex. I did this work in the ground in Ghana once, and it's so time consuming. And for many smallholder farmers, they have to come to terms with the technology, do the georeferencing, and getting the coordinates, and it's very complex. And sometimes, and as you rightly pointed out, this information, there has been no consultation whatsoever with people on the ground. So it's come to them very suddenly, and they've had to comply. So best practice, I would say, the case of Vietnam, where they've coordinated an effort. It's a gargantuan effort to coordinate so many different stakeholders. And I would say that the learning that I take from this is it needs to be an effort where you have the public sector, the private sector. You need to have cooperatives, producer organizations all on board and working together. So it's not an easy task, and it really requires a lot of effort from all sides, and really all hands on deck to get this work done.
Thank you for that. That's a really good point, right? No one industry, no one player has the answer. That collaboration really is key. And I think that actually is a nice transition to the next part of our conversation, looking at collaboration, accountability, and the consumer connection, right? So we haven't really talked much about the consumer yet or their understanding of these factors. So I want to turn our attention there, right? So Carla, maybe you can start us off. What do you see as the role of consumers in addressing these challenges that we're talking about today? And is there a danger of brand suppliers, other stakeholders overburdening them with ethical decisions, or are they really a critical lever for change?
I really appreciate the question. And often with my students, we think about this, which are the groups of people that are kind of the least consulted in cocoa and chocolate, farmers and consumers. And they are the furthest from one another along the value chain. And consumers have an enormous role to play in all of this, although it is not a role that one should ever seek to undertake individually. We talk a lot about notions of like vote with your dollars, etc. None of that works or matters unless you do it as a group. All of the things most worth doing are those that we do with other people. And so I think that there is a danger of putting a heavy burden on consumers who realistically, when we go and look at a shelf of chocolate wherever we are, we know that people spend maybe about 30 seconds choosing their product. So realistically, we cannot expect that consumers should be able to evaluate every single product that they buy to determine whether or not it matches their own changing, different levels of informed value systems. In an ideal world, they would, reach a shelf, purchase a product, and it would already meet a certain set of values. So without putting too much burden on consumers, I do think consumers have the possibility to insist on the changes that they wish to see. And that means that if they have access to companies that they wish to support, they can play a role in, cross-promoting those companies to friends, to family, and more. They can write to their local governments. I mean, vote with your dollars, also vote with your votes. Insist that the people who are in power in your government are doing things that you think are right for the planet. Insist that they're answering these kinds of hard questions. So my thought is consumers are a very key lever in all of this, as long as we're realistic about what they're able to do.
I think that's a really good point, right? About being realistic, and shopping is its own challenge, right? And consumers do make choices really quickly, and sometimes they're willing to take a deeper dive the first time they make that choice, but that doesn't often happen at the point of sale. And so, Sarah, I'm curious, how does certification like the Rainforest Alliance, help bridge that gap between consumers and brands and alleviate the pressure on each?
Yeah, I think what Carla mentioned is yeah, really important just because consumers obviously have only a certain amount of influence, right, on what they buy or the decisions that they make, but they can vote with their dollars, like she was saying. And I think third-party certification seals like that of the Rainforest Alliance or others can be a kind of bridge or a translator between consumers and brands. And they can be around raising awareness about some of those important sustainability challenges that we discussed, but it can also help to really create trust and transparency and that shared responsibility that we've mentioned within the supply chain, right? So it's supposed to help both sides, both the consumers and the companies, to help make more informed decisions, ethical decisions, and certification can offer that assurance that products can align with certain values. But again, keeping in mind that consumers obviously have some limitations, but they can decide which companies or organizations they do want to support.
Thank you. I think, Carla, you also mentioned voting with your votes, which I think is funny, but also voting with your dollars, which we hear a lot. And I think that can be really powerful. But the reality is that today's economic environment is tough, right? Consumers are very strapped. They're looking to stretch their dollars as much as they can, but we also know they do want treats. So, Danny, this one is to you, and it actually is coming from the audience. And it says that given the efforts that you all are making, right, how is Tony's staying affordable to the consumer? How are you making that work?
Yeah, it's a good question. And sorry, I didn't see that in the Q&A. It was in the chat section. Yeah, I think obviously Tony is a global company, right? And having started in European markets, I think if you think a little bit more downstream, like we are, we do benefit from operating in European markets and being, at least in our US business, to anchor on some of that. And what I mean by that is just like the cost of distribution, right? Like in the US to be in retail, the cost of distribution is really expensive. But I think being a global company that we are, being a Dutch-based company and having operated in European markets for the last 20 years, there's obviously the price transparency, right? And what we're doing around impact and all the costs associated with that. And you can see that in our impact report. We, for Tony's Open Chain, show our P&L so that everybody can see that. But yeah, I think a little bit more downstream, it's important. And obviously looking at your partnerships and contracts with supply chain partners, right, at the processor level with your co-manufacturers. And again, I'm a little more removed from that part of the business, but if you were to talk to anyone on our supply chain or operations team, I think there's a lot of investment in making sure that there are really good long-term relationships in place. We talk a lot about the long-term commitment. We also see that throughout our entire supply chain, right? And I think obviously with that comes with maybe some cost benefit. I think it's great to see that here I'm just reading the Q&A that it's relatively affordable to the consumer. It obviously sits on shelf, I think, more expensively than your traditional chocolate company does. But yeah, I think all of those kind of come together in a way that does make it relatively affordable to the consumer.
So price is important, and I appreciate your input there on how you're managing that. But
Yeah.
I also, real quick, I'm curious, Tony's does talk a lot about the challenges that it's addressing, and I
Yeah.
think it does it in a unique way and an accessible way. But can you tell us a little bit about how Tony's approaches this without creating ethics fatigue or greenwashing?
Yeah, for sure. I think I'd usually take a back seat to this question, mainly because Tony's Open Chain, the part of Tony's that I work for, is what we like to call like a pre-competitive, and therefore like business to business solution that again is very focused on putting the farmer and co-ops at the center of the conversation. Rarely is Tony's Open Chain directly engaging with consumers in the way a traditional brand might, like Tony's Chocolate Only or Ben and Jerry's. I think that said, it's important for us, those who are part of Tony's Open Chain, like myself, to show up in spaces like this, right? Because the challenges we've discussed today, and a lot of us have already talked about this, aren't something that any one actor can solve alone, right? It does take collective action between companies that source cocoa, like Tony's, civil society, NGOs, government, academia. I think how consumer-facing brands choose to talk about these issues will vary, right? There's no one-size-fits-all approach. You're talking about Tony's Chocolate only. I mean, they've been really creative, right, in raising awareness at the consumer level. I think one of the ways, and I think the example I like the most is how they communicate that through our packaging, right? Highlighting the 5 sourcing principles. So when you actually open up the packaging, you can see and learn about the 5 sourcing principles. You even see it in the design of the actual chocolate bars, right? Which are intentionally divided into unequal pieces to represent the inequality in the cocoa supply chain. Feastables is another partner of ours at Tony's Open Chain. Though some of you might be familiar with who Mr. Beast is, right? He's the biggest YouTuber in the world. And he talks about cocoa in a very different way than, let's say, Tony's does or Ben and Jerry's does, also another mission ally. And I think that's okay as long as brands are keeping, those at origin, right? Farmers and their families and the community at the center of those conversations, and also investing in not just like through sourcing, but also in those community efforts. I think that's what matters. The format or channel, like I said, is gonna look a little different. And you're asking about authenticity. I think that depends on how deeply a company's mission is embedded in its sourcing strategy. If a brand is sourcing cocoa, I think it obviously needs to go in a way do so in a way that goes beyond greenwashing and truly invest in the upstream supply chain at origin. I think we were talking that chocolate is an indulgent product, right? And I think it should be. I try to remind myself every time I walk past the unlimited chocolate in our office right behind me. But indulgent doesn't mean ignorance, right? Like whether it's chocolate or other high risk commodities like coffee or palm oil, like if a product contains these high risk commodities, I think we just need to be mindful of what's behind it. Obviously at Tony's Open Chain, we're not shying away from these hard truths. We're going directly at those challenges, and we're transparent of what's working and also what's not. And I think that honesty builds trust, not just with our partners, but ultimately with consumers. And I think it's a big reason also why Tony's Chocolate Only has seen such strong commercial success.
Fantastic. Thank you. Um, we're having a fantastic conversation, and it's mind-blowing to me that we're already at the 4-minute mark, which is exactly enough time for each of you to take 1 minute to share with us, right, a takeaway action. What do you want attendees to leave today with and maybe actually do in the next 6 months? Ingrid, why don't you start us off?
I'm actually very optimistic in general. I see that we're undergoing a very meaningful transformation where we see so many stakeholders that are committed to sharing responsibility, setting common goals, implementing joint projects, exchanging knowledge and experiences. And we continuously work to trying to have better mechanisms to track our progress and just have an overall good system. One thing that I could recommend to people out there would be go to a local chocolatier. Here in Europe, we have numerous small-scale businesses, chocolate companies that put so much effort, so much love in craftsmanship, in origin, and giving the consumer a really meaningful product and experience. So I would say check that out. Try the smaller companies as well. So we don't only have small scale producers in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire and all these places. We also have small businesses that could really benefit from your dollars, and try those for sure.
Love that call to action. We'll be taking you up on it. Carla, what about you?
I really appreciate that from Dr. Fromm, and I would echo the same. What I would add to it, in addition, I mentioned at the beginning that I think a lot of the problems we're facing are non-chocolate problems. One that I would really encourage people to look into is the fossil fuel industry and its impact on climate change. The reason that cocoa producers are experiencing the impacts of climate change disproportionately is not so much because of cocoa as it is because of the fossil fuel industry. So if you're looking for a way to have a big impact, it is to actually hold the fossil fuel industry to account. And the same would be true of holding the 1% of wealthy people who hold more wealth than the vast majority of the rest of us to account. That would mean don't allow billionaires to come in and run governments for periods of months. So anything that you as an individual can do that is actually separate from chocolate as you enjoy your chocolate is an essential action to take right now.
if we had the time, I would call for a full minute of silence for your call to action to set in. But hope that that sits with everybody. Sarah, what about you?
Yeah, I think there were so many things that we discussed today that really resonated. I mean, going back to the cocoa space, I think awareness and knowledge of some of the challenges is key, but it's as important to really understand what some of the solutions are and what some of the collective action is that we can take. So my key takeaway, I think, is that everyone has a part to play in making chocolate more sustainable and ethical. So, on the farmer side, they can improve agricultural practices, farm resilience. Companies really do need to invest and innovate, through more responsible purchasing practices, targeted interventions. NGOs, academic institutions can offer tools, guidance, training, support, but also really landscape initiatives, right? Bringing all of these different players around the table and really looking at what works from a community and farmer-centric approach. Governments can offer regulatory frameworks, and then consumers, as we've already discussed, can choose which products they want to buy and which organizations they want to support.
Fantastic. And Danny, the last minute of our conversation goes to you.
Yeah, I'll try to keep it short. I mean, I'm looking at just some of the resources that Carla shared, and I think when you think about like a simple, tangible action we can all take here is like go read that. Those resources that she shared. I mean, for me, and again, I'm actually still pretty new to the space. I joined Tony's back in January. There's been so much in learning about cocoa and the challenges that we've all said don't just exist, I think, here, but also across other key commodities. And I think if there's one takeaway I'd leave the audience with is that you can't, I talk a lot about like ownership and responsibility, right? I think you can't take responsibility of your supply chain unless you understand the realities of the households and the families within it. So, for those maybe who are actually able to as well, like try to get to, the furthest upstream actor you can in the supply chain of the foods that you're eating, right? Instead of maybe your next vacation to the Caribbean, like try to visit a farm, whether it's domestically or overseas. I think that would be so interesting and obviously provide some like real education. For us at Tony's Own Machine, even if you look at, we were talking a lot about like our CLMRS, like which we touched on, like that means taking accountability and protecting like 50,000 plus children in the households that we source from. And again, like a big takeaway that I'm always leaving folks with, it's not about enforcement. It's not about catching children, right? Like 95% of cases are identified through open conversations with families and children themselves. And that's the heart of our approach, right? And one that I leave everyone with. It really is like it's building trust and it's understanding the social realities and working together to find a better option. It's also why we're working not just with families at origin, right, but with government, civil society to improve the broader enabling environment, right? Access to services and resources like education and healthcare. So if there's any way, folks can take a tangible action there in supporting those improved services, right, in the communities that that need it the most. I think that's where real change comes from, right? True collaboration and steady progress at the community level. I think moving from, what I like to call compliance to shared responsibility to co-ownership.
Fantastic. Thank you. I love this idea that eating treats and going on vacation can do good. So thank you all for your takeaways and all of your insights today. I really appreciate it. And I'm so grateful for attendees for tuning in and for our hosts for bringing us together. So with that, I will hand the floor back to you, Lauren.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth, for moderating today's discussion, and to our expert panelists, Danny, Sarah, Carla, and Ingrid. You were all fantastic. I have a lot of reading to do over the next couple of days. But we're also very grateful to Business Location Switzerland for making this series possible. And so, as I'd mentioned earlier, today's session is part of our Cocoa Futures webinar series, where we're exploring the forces shaping chocolate's next era, from sustainability and sourcing to breakthrough technologies and new consumer experiences. We encourage you to join us for our last session on October 29th, where we'll hear a deeper look at changing consumer preferences in the market for premium chocolate. So if you'd like to learn more about Branch Food, our work with innovators, investors, please reach out to me. Also happy to share our contacts at Business Location Switzerland to support your interests as well. So thank you again for joining us. We look forward to continuing the conversation and seeing you all at our next Cocoa Futures session in 2 weeks on October 29th. and I will drop our Eventbrite in there for those of you that haven't signed up for it yet. So thank you all and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Goodbye.
everyone.
you.